All right, should we begin to move forward? We have three, right. So these are kind of, actually a fairly coherent set of papers, all... No? I thought...
No, it's like as if your previous stuff wasn't.
Oh, well, okay. So these are all roughly on the theme of sovereignty and different conceptions of sovereignty. That's how I group them together. And we'll start with Scott Hamilton, who's a postdoc at Balsillie School of International Affairs and up at Waterloo, and we'll move forward one at a time from there. So. Hi, everyone. Everyone can hear me okay? Cool. So, thanks, Alex, very much for the invitation. Thrilled to be here. We've talked a lot about American political science, so I guess I'm going to be that token guy who went to school in Europe and will now talk to you about Foucault. So, diving into that, just as a bit of a warm-up, because whenever I tell someone now that I'm doing some research into quantum and quantum theory, I typically get the response, well, it's mind-blowing, why can't we all do it? So just to tell a little bit of a story in way of an introduction, and this is actually true. This is from an episode of The Simpsons in 1998, and what you have is Homer writing an equation on the blackboard for what appears to be maybe the quantum mass of a donut. It turns out 14 years later, the equation that Homer wrote actually came true, and what he was doing was predicting the mass of the Higgs boson particle. Actually, and this is true. So Homer beat the Large Hadron Collider to the mass of the Higgs boson 14 years before it happened. So I like to think if Homer Simpson can figure out the mass of the Higgs boson, then I can at least figure out a little bit of what quantum mechanics is all about. So coming from a series of presentations like ISA, the logic is, well, if after all of those presentations people can remember one thing from it, then maybe it was a decent session, it was a decent presentation. So I hope this is at least one fact that everyone can take from this presentation. But why am I actually here? I'm here to tell you about at least my very introductory conceptual meanderings into what I call quantum governmentality. And for those of you not familiar with governmentality, it's a mishmash of tools and theories and practices that are used throughout the social sciences today. It's developed by Michel Foucault. But generally, it's not thinking of government or the state as, let's say, a top-down form of power. It is to analyze government as a particular mode of thinking, or as Foucault described it, the exercise of power is a conduct of conduct and a management of possibilities. And it covers the whole range of practices that constitute, define, organize, and instrumentalize the strategies that individuals in their freedom can use in dealing with each other. The basis for all this is freedom, the relationship of the self to the self, and the relationship of the self to the other. So long story short, it's not about material power the government is all about. It is, if someone's not holding a gun to your head, why are you doing the things that you're doing? Why do you go out and, let's say, check the label of your ingredients at the grocery store? Or why do you exercise at the gym? Why do you line up to vote? Why do you think that's a good thing? How do social, historical, and linguistic concepts come to constitute the practices that define yourself in the world? That's generally what governmentality is all about. It is a mentality of how you govern yourself and others. What do you mean by quantum governmentality? This is really an exploratory paper. I just found out there was a Dropbox yesterday, so the paper's up online if anyone wants to check it out. I'd really value your comments and contributions. My apologies again to Jairus, who is my discussant at ISA, because what I thought would be a small paper mushroomed into what I think could be 2 to 3 papers that I plan to cut down. Why governmentality? What does it have to do with physics or quantum? I think it actually has to do, there's a surprising amount there for us. So governmentality itself, for anyone who's read Foucault's lectures, Security, Territory, Population, Foucault is very adamant that physics has always been connected to politics. And he traces that throughout his governmentality lectures, and in 2 primary ways. One, governmentality actually mirrors physics throughout the entire Foucauldian lectures. Not only is nature always connected to politics, but even throughout, by the end of the lectures, he's using force, equilibrium, dynamics to discuss things like the balance of power and the constitution of states in Europe. So there's the actual direct connection. But also implicitly in Foucault's own work, prior to developing the actual notion of governmentality, in previous lectures he was dealing with the classical Newtonian concepts of the milieu, action at a distance, and it was only through working through classical physics that he then came up with governmentality. Once governmentality develops, he completely drops that kind of Newtonian feel. So if governmentality was always connected to classical physics, then what might a quantum governmentality be? So that's what I'm exploring. I do not think Foucault was doing quantum secretly. I do not think all of Foucault's work is perfectly transferable to quantum and vice versa. I just think some of the concepts from one group really fit well with some of the concepts from another. They can work very well together, maybe help us think differently about problems we've always taken for granted. That's kind of the ethos of the paper. How do I do it? I'm generally, or I was, critical of the whole quantum approach. I published a paper on it last year, and as Leah was saying, it's like I was surprised. That was a bit more of a negative approach, and now you're taking a bit of a positive one. And as I was actually going back and I was starting to research the research on this paper, I came across the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. What I was surprised about when I started reading the old texts of Bohr and Heisenberg was how much it actually mirrored a lot of the fundamental thought of Foucault himself. So how is that? Well, the Copenhagen interpretation, I'm obviously not going to dive into the complexities of like the math, because that's way beyond me. Generally, what they found the math revealed about reality was something so strange and so bizarre. Instead of focusing on all the math, they actually doubled back and said, what's preventing us from recognizing what this is telling us about reality is actually the way our linguistic, our social, our historical, and our cultural concepts have been constituted in our own minds, in our own subjectivity. So that's actually what's holding us back from understanding what quantum is trying to tell us. So math to them was a particular language that was revealing something about reality. There's nothing special or inherent about math. It was just that particular mode that allowed them to access reality in a particular way. So that resonates very highly, I think, with Foucault. His entire logic is the way that we think and the way we are governed is determined by social, cultural, linguistic, and historical practices. So right off the bat, I was thinking, this is odd. I didn't expect to find a bunch of old theoretical physicists sounding like the first generation of post-structuralist thinkers. But why not dive in, right? That's the way of the quantum. So there's 3 stages in the paper. Very quickly, I'll go through the first stage, and that's where I generally align some of the kind of overlaps or similarities between the Copenhagen interpretation with governmentality. And that has to do with the nature of truth. So when you admit or you take that the concepts that form your general way of thinking are historical, they're social, they're malleable, that underlies both the Copenhagen interpretation and Foucault more generally. I found a similarity in terms of their treatment of ubiquity and holism. So for the Copenhagen interpretation and quantum in general, you have these background notions of a quantum field or the wave function, which generally constitutes the background condition for being, right? It's potentiality waiting to collapse into actuality. And it plays a very similar role of, especially in his later work, Foucault's concept of power. Again, it's this background notion or field that constitutes every social relation, and it's what's responsible for actualizing potentiality into a particular event or a manifestation of where 2 people can interact. And that comes into practice. Laura Zanotti has actually published a very good article on this recently, talking about how the Copenhagen interpretation's notion of a practice or a measurement apparatus resonates very highly with Foucault's account, which has to do with the way that our background field of power or subjectivity is actually manifested into being, so we can actually debate it, discuss it, interact with it, is through social practices. It's where this underlying subjectivity is able to be actualized into reality, and that's generally what Foucault studied. The rest of the paper is what I'll go through now, so I just pick out a few combinations that I found interesting or worthy of exploration, and then I'll conclude with what I think a quantum governmentality actually could be through self-constitution, ethics, and art. So first had to do, it was something I found similar to the notion of complementarity. So light can be both a discretized particle and a wave, and I guess technically everything could be when you get down to it. There's a very similar notion of that in governmentality, where power is described as being simultaneously individual and total. It can both be multiple, comprising a social field, a polity, and it can be individual, comprising the relation of oneself to others. And you actually have Foucault discussing this in much of his earlier work. He talks about governmentality. You take a household, right? You have relationships between the father and the mother, and then between the kids, and then between the notion that social norms come in for jobs, the way that politics goes in and comprises that household. And looking around governmentality scholarship, I found that we actually don't do that in the field. We typically take one particular analysis of governmentality and block out all the others. And that happens a lot in something recent called the global governmentality debate. It's generally a debate, to make a long story short, where we all say, I've got the right version. Here's my version. This is what's correct. So why not a complementarity of governmentality? Why not an analysis with multiple overlapping governmentalities oriented around one particular practice, with each of those reflecting or trying to crystallize or bring into being a new mode of understanding how one person, multiple people think about that particular object or practice. Maybe it's been done. If it has, I'd love recommendations, and if not, it's just one example for me how trying to bring in some of these quantum concepts helped me reconceptualize how Foucault's concepts might also work in tandem. Another one, the uncertainty of governmentality. So we know the uncertainty of Heisenberg, right? You can't measure momentum and position at the exact same time. You interfere with one, and it changes the other. And because of that, it breaks down the subject-object binary, right? You can never have a fully constituted totality of an object because every single interaction with it changes the object and changes yourself. And it's actually very similar to a lot of Foucauldian thought, as odd as it is. So if anyone out there has ever done a genealogy, a genealogy is not a history of the past, it's a history of the present. It's a history of the present because our daily subjectivity is constantly changing, every second, every minute, every day. So that's why, hypothetically, if you did a genealogy using Foucauldian methods every single day with the exact same materials, it would constantly change. Not because the materials have changed, but because your own subjectivity has, throughout the own interactions that you have throughout various modes of your day. So that was one thing that was very similar. The other is that every governmentality analysis, every genealogy is designed to bring into being things you didn't know were there before. It's designed to kind of shock your own subjectivity into revealing concepts that were there, but were not previously recognizable. So there's always an uncertainty to every Foucauldian analytic, to every genealogical analysis, to every governmentality analytic. And the quote here, the theoretical and practical experience we have of our limits and of the possibility of moving beyond them is always limited and determined, thus we're always in the position of beginning again. So that's the catch with a lot of Foucauldian work, right? There's no universal grounding. It means you can come up with something new and unpredictable and unexpected about your own work, but you're always going to be doing that again and again and again, because you and everything around you will always change. And entanglement of governmentality. I know this is Bell. It's not for Heisenberg, but I thought it was interesting, and it's one of those concepts that seems to be debated and discussed frequently, so I thought I would do it myself. What really jumped out in the Foucauldian literature for me is the interplay of subjectivity and entanglement. Really resonated with the notion of a power relation. So to be entangled, two particles have to actually meet to become entangled, then to be separated. And while they're entangled, they're part of their own closed, almost like mini universe. And as soon as that mini universe becomes, or is put into contact with something external, that entanglement breaks down, right? So you can have that in a laser in a laboratory. As soon as the external world enters in, it decoheres and collapses. And in many ways, it's very similar to a lot of the power relations that Foucauldian literature discusses. So take this room, for example. We can interact with one another, and in a sense, we are entangled in terms of that particular power relation. We can't escape it. We play off one another. There are different ways our subjectivity is interacted. But as soon as one person leaves that room, that power relation breaks down. It's almost very Arendtian in a way, right? Power only exists when two people interact, debate each other, discuss. But as soon as those people break that relation, power breaks down. You know, the field is decohered in a sense. So I found that was also another interesting conceptual overlap governmentality could explore. But how? Quantum basis for agency. And I have about 2 minutes here, so I'll wrap up quickly. At the end of Foucault's Over, my French accent is horrible, he talks about ethics. And ethics is not the kind of normative social constraints or obligations that we feel we have to do. It's not a moral thing. He actually sees ethics as a process of self-constitution. So ethics is the way that we critique ourselves and how our social, historical, and linguistic concepts have come to form how we act in the world. The problem with Foucault and his notion of ethics, well, one, he died shortly after he started talking about this, so he couldn't really expand upon them. But two, a lot of commentators have noted how they are very white, very male, and very Western-centric, typically based on Greeks or Baudelaire's conception of the dandy. So I was thinking, okay, well, what about those three quantum principles, so this notion of a quantum agency, of classical Aristotelian potentia? What if that could be the notion for a new potential ethics for Foucault? Would these two work? It's essentially the recognition that the boundaries of your subjectivity change and how to change them going forth. So how might this new ethics work? And it has to do with the notion of the subject, the quantum subject of government. So for anyone familiar, again, with Foucault's work, the subject has two meanings for him. You're subject to someone else by control and dependence, and you're tied to your own identity by conscience or self-knowledge. So it subjugates and makes subject to. But what I find interesting about introducing the notion of quantum and some of these concepts into the Foucauldian literature is that there's another form of subject. Right? Hypothetically, a subject is a historical construct. There's no limit to what form a subject can take. So what about subject as the choice and the freedom of the bringing of oneself, others, and the world into being? Having that potential freedom to go out into the world and to realize, maybe to use Barad's language, the cuts you make in the world literally manifest that into being. How might I go about studying this? This is where the politics comes in. This is done in a very rudimentary way in the paper, but it's what I'll try and do going forth. The I, as the essence of subjectivity, the subject that we all are, that is nothing permanent, right? That's shifted historically. And how can we trace that? One thing that Foucault, the Copenhagen interpretation, everyone talks about science and politics and international relations. One thing all three talk about is the nature of art and subjective perspective, the impact that the I has upon the way that subjectivity perceives the world and represents itself. So it's tough to visualize quantum politically, right? And that's been a kind of an underlying theme of the whole workshop, is that we know what the subatomic world is like. How the heck can we actually get that into the political realm? Well, it's interesting tracing these transformations through art. So how has classical physics impacted the way that subjectivity represents the self artistically? So here you have a painting from the 15th century. There's no I at this time. There's no classical physics, so you have no vanishing point. You have no single perspective. So what happens when the I, the classical Cartesian perspective, is introduced? Well, then you actually get a single I that can see and project out the world and posit boundaries. And like Brugge was writing way back in 1993, this is also how you get the state. So the constitution of classical physics, subjectivity is an I, and politics is clearly entwined here. So what happens if we actually explore this historically? What could that reveal to us today about how art, science, and politics are actually entwined? Maybe we can detect what form of politics we're entering by looking to art. So here you have a representation of a quantum field of probability. There's no I, just a mess. And you do see maybe some forms of art that are trying to replicate this kind of, I think it's synesthetic, tactorial sense. Instead of just the visual, it is a weird variety of the human sensorium that's being brought into play. So the notion of a quantum politics, what makes it so difficult to think about is that technically there would be no I in a quantum politics. The I is classical, it's Cartesian. So how do we think of a quantum politics where there is no I when we're an I, right? It ties into the whole paradox of quantum physics itself. So I will try and engage this in a genealogical way. If anyone has any suggestions. I never thought I'd be doing IR in art. This is an entirely new direction, which I guess this is what we're supposed to be pulled into. So to wrap up, the Copenhagen interpretation and governmentality are compatible in some ways, definitely not in others. I'm not saying they're the same thing or that they're perfect, only that some concepts work very well together, and thinking about those is both fun and productive. So governmentality might act as a bridge between our political subjectivity and quantum. I think it can provide a stable base for Foucault's ethics, more so than dead Western white guys. I think it's at least a route worth exploring. And why quantum? The point of all of Foucault's work was take the boundaries of your present subjectivity and try to move beyond them. And how? Right? Genealogy, governmentality, whatever, why not quantum? If it helps us think differently, I think it's viable. And for those of you who are either in entire disagreement or just straight up bored during my presentation, at least you can remember that Homer discovered the Higgs boson in 1998. And I'll finish with that. So. Questions, if any? Sure.
Yeah, I thought your comment about entanglement, sort of spreading out and disappearing over time was interesting. And one thing about financial entanglement, like a loan agreement and a debt, is that it's kind of designed to not decohere. You know, it's sort of designed to hang around, and that's one of the problems. Just one other comment. I thought the thing about aesthetics and the quantum aesthetics is a really interesting point. And there's also, you can sort of look at scientific theories also as having an aesthetic component. So some scientific theories seem kind of associated with particular aesthetic. In something like a mathematical model, you can say that a mathematical model kind of looks right because it sort of has all the right things, And so it could be kind of an interesting line of attack is actually to make the link with aesthetics, say that changing the aesthetic would actually have a big impact on practice. So is that sort of what you're getting at here a little bit? That maybe a theory of international relations that was based on a different kind of aesthetic might look different, might be appealing to people.
Yeah, I mean, in asking what could a quantum politics look like, we typically say, I am going to look at the state and look at quantum and then see how that's going to change. So what if that orientation could be mixed up slightly? What if, knowing that the way that, and I'm not an art person, this is all very new to me, but it seems that if physics and the way that we represent ourselves artistically are tied together, and for Heisenberg, art and science, there was no preference. He said art is just a different way of revealing the spirit of the times, just like math is. They're just different languages for revealing a background reality. So if we adopted, let's say, that perspective, then what might this artistic reality tell us about the way politics can function? If we are existing as humans, but without that single standpoint. I mean, I'm not sure. I just found it interesting. The way that visualization of a quantum field tended to mirror some of the synesthetic style art that is happening now. Whether there's a connection there might be, or there might not. It might have just been a lucky Google search. So, sorry, in the back.
Could you speak some more to your statement about practice as a measurement apparatus?
Mm-hmm.
And you use the phrase evental emergence.
Yeah.
Kind of explication there. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah, sorry. This one, Foucault has probably just as many jargony terms as quantum theorists. So evental emergence, or an event, is a place you can think about where Aristotle's potentiality collapses into actuality historically. And that typically happens through something concrete. So Foucauldian methodology, a genealogy doesn't look for historical events that text finds. It looks for a particular event that it could be unexpected, it could be contingent, but a place where a surprising piece of ourselves just pops into being where it shouldn't. It's tough to I guess the way that Bohr looks at it, or Heisenberg, is that you have this background, let's say a wave function or infinite potentiality. It is all and nothing at the same time. What causes that to collapse into an event or a thing that can be measured is actually the measurement apparatus that almost manifests that particular particle into being. So that's why you can't have a separation between subject and object, because literally you as the measurer and your measuring device is cutting this thing into existence in a very particular way. And that's a particular practice. This is what Jairus was basically picking up on at ISA, and it's something I need to flesh out more. But there's something in which the way that people engage socially in classical practices, access, whether it's the quantum field or power or whatever, the underlying, say, background, how that becomes a thing we can think about, talk about, and measure is important. I'll go Mark, and then I'll go to the back.
No, I think that just to forward that, I think that one of the good examples that Foucault uses, that Scott uses elsewhere, is like the census brings into being populations. Like the census is a tool of measurement, then renders certain populations available for measurement, quantification, analysis, and so on. And so it's not that there weren't people there before, but the census crystallizes those people into an operationalizable population. Would that be?
Yeah, that's excellent. It's more eloquent than I could phrase it, but yeah. That's the way governmentality typically functions, right? It says it takes a particular field, which we may constitute as nothing or everything, and it can carve into being things like populations and things we take for granted today. All of our norms, the reasons we do the things we do. It's an analysis that goes back and tries to figure out how those things were first crafted into being suddenly, unexpectedly, contingently through these particular events. Sorry, is it the back? And then I'll go to Michael.
My question is about, you introduced the idea of governmentality as when you gave these examples, they were actually about individuals performing behaviors, like self-governing.
Yeah.
But then you're talking about kind of moving outside of a subjectivity that's just a monadic bit or window or something. So I wonder, in terms of what you just said, the example of the census, for example, when you say between political subjectivity to the quantum, are you considering subjectivity as founded in the idea of an I, or are you considering group membership subjectivities like unions or groups of people or academics or children or something? Or what do you mean when you say we're working on the governmentality of subjectivity in this project?
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
misunderstood.
no, I mean, that's a great question, right? And that's one thing, like governmentality itself can analyze the state, the union, the individual up to global polity. It depends on what referent of analysis you're trying to take. So I think hypothetically this could tie into the complementarity idea to analyze the individual, the union, the group, the region, any amount of variety. Myself, I don't know, I've been reading a ton of Bohr and Heisenberg, so whether or not we can actually escape the metaphysical presuppositions of the I don't think we can right now. So when we posit quantum, we're always going to do it from the perspective of a classical Cartesian subjectivity. But how to momentarily short-circuit that and jump out of it, that's basically what a genealogy is designed to do. It's short-circuiting your own brain and your own historical concepts so you can, something unexpected, right? Surprise can happen. I don't know if that helps. So whether or not it's, sure.
Genealogy is still of a person, so like your genealogy of your, is that what you mean? Or could you do like genealogy of a group or a collective or a moment, a group membership or an interlocking social space, or?
Yeah, I mean,
Just
this is...
how if you're starting from an I, are you thinking you're already limiting yourself by starting from this Cartesian subject when you do your genealogy, or not? Maybe because it doesn't matter if it's I or like, because it's all.
Yeah, I mean...
Anyways, we're tricking ourselves by saying it's not, but what do you think?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think hypothetically you can take whatever referent you want, right, and submit it to analysis. And that's the nature of it. Is that it's a particular toolbox where you're going to apply your tool. Right? So it might be a state, it might be a union, it might be an individual. Again, this is very new to me. I'm just kind of fleshing it out. So if anyone has any suggestions on the paper, that would be great. But for me personally, I take ancient, and sorry for anyone who's heard this example before, but take the ancient Greeks, right? We can walk into a museum, we can learn about them, we can learn about their metaphysics, we can learn about their practices and whatever. We will have no understanding what it was like to be an ancient Greek and how they actually thought and how they actually functioned. This is why it technically takes like 15 years of solid study just to read the Republic properly, because all of the terms and concepts like causality, right? Ancient Greeks would have no idea what our notion of cause and effect is. They just didn't have it. They had a fourfold causality, which is a whole bunch of things combined into one: the maker, the cause, the material, the tool. So for us to say, reading and researching quantum, we're going to be able to snap out of our Western kind of Cartesian classical subjectivity, that's really tough to do, right? And so reading about ancient Greeks doesn't help us grasp their metaphysics any more than reading quantum will help us anticipate a new one. If it does happen, I think this is the kind of this is how the change, I think, can be started or fomented or perhaps led, but I think it's extremely difficult, right? It's essentially a paradigm shift of incredible proportions. So I'm using this as just a way to try and think differently, maybe for a split second, jump out of the usual presuppositions that help shape that individual subjectivity, whether it's the I or the union. But whether or not we'll be able to go full-blown quantum, I hope we can. That would be really cool, but in that sense, I'm still skeptical but hopeful.
Can I just jump in on this? Because I guess when I hear you say no I, are you saying then no consciousness? Because I mean, the consciousness never figures in Foucault. I mean, any Foucauldian talking about consciousness is like really suspicious.
It's like Heidegger. He never talks about it.
So, is that what are you also denying consciousness or
No.
pushing it aside? Or because this
No,
seems like
actually.
a big difference actually between Foucault and at least some of the strains of quantum thinking.
This is why one thing that even this workshop has led me towards, and the previous presentation as well, which was non-representationalist metaphysics, or political ways of thinking that do not have the actual Cartesian subjective I, right? If the I is an historical Western European practice,
Consciousness? Wait, you're saying consciousness or the
I'm saying consciousness and
So you
humanity
think
go
consciousness
together.
is a modern Western.
No, I think
Okay,
that
all right.
there have been as long as there's been human subjects, I think there's been thought, right? So I'm not saying that consciousness somehow magically manifested itself with Descartes. So I think the I is the particular Western practice, and you can see that through art, right? So it's amazing about old pictures. There's just no perspective. I mean, we take it as basic, but they lacked that whole entire perspective. They were clearly very conscious. So in this, I think, with a quantum shift, what form will consciousness take? That is really, really tough to anticipate. And maybe artistic renderings can help, maybe not. I don't know. I'll have to ask the person working at the art school.
The issue of consciousness, I'm not sure I can follow the discussion here. From the Foucault's whatever perspective, whatever you call it, the issue of the subject is quite complicated.
Yep.
And you seem to be talking more about the Cartesian subject than let's call it the Foucauldian subject, if it means anything. We all know about the decentering almost discussion with the death of the author. So there's a huge background there when it comes to subjectivity from a Foucauldian perspective.
Yeah.
But then you jump into consciousness, and then you go beyond even the Western perspective on consciousness, and I'm lost in here because consciousness in different cultures or different civilizations, whatever you call it, might be something very different that what Foucault was talking about, and I also would take that Alex is talking about. So how can you jump from one to the other like that quickly? I'm just lost, basically. Please give me some light.
Sure. I'm not saying that magically we're going to shift into a new form of consciousness. I just think the way that everyone constitutes themselves as an individual, whether it's today to be subject is to be an I, right? That is the result of very particular historical Western, in this case, social, linguistic, cultural practices and whatever. And that those can change, right? And they probably will change. They always have. I don't see why they always wouldn't. Right? Foucault called it a game of truth. Call it a paradigm if you want, or a particular metaphysical system. Foucault called it a game of truth. And he agreed. He was actually a big fan of science. He never denied any scientific stuff as ridiculous or tools of power or whatever. All he said was that these particular games of truth, how the subject is constituted, how objects are constituted, will shift over time. Right? So that's all I'm kind of trying to ask is, if this is the case, how might our practices, our ways of thinking about ourselves and others shift over time?
I think we should probably wrap it up so we can keep going. But
Sure, no, those are great questions, and I value them. So, thank you.
all right, so let me just say, so I'm going to turn to Quinn Riley, who's going to talk about Hobbes and the state of nature. And I'm just going to say a few more words than I have in the past with the other presentations, because I know Quinn much better than most of you, because she's been my research assistant this past year. And actually, she's also one of 3 undergrads who is at the workshop today. The other 2 are sitting straight ahead, Grace Wright and Gates Young, and they are the future. And also, their brains are less deformed by classical thinking than the rest of us because they're younger. So we should listen to the young people. Quinn, just by way of introduction to her paper, spent most of last semester actually building a new website for me, a more personalized professional website, alexanderwendt.org. Very important. The relationship of which is the theme of which is the relationship between my work and metal. So I'm sure you'll all want to go check that out. She did a fantastic job. But while she was working on that, she was also started tracking my quantum reading and stuff, and then started reading my book. And then a few weeks ago, she had just an idea, just kind of off the top of her head, I think, that Hobbes' conceptualization of the state of nature is very classical, and she's a Hobbes scholar as a political theorist in her political science program. And she wondered what would happen if you changed or reread Hobbes in a quantum narrative. And so she floated this idea by me, and my immediate reaction was this was a publishable article right there. It was just like, this is an article just waiting to be picked up and written, and it could be in a political theory journal. And so I encouraged her to go forward. So she hasn't written a word of it yet, but I did think that she might benefit from giving you guys the elevator pitch and see what kind of feedback you guys have and positive suggestions, or tell her to skip the whole idea or whatever. So she's going to go out on a limb with some very preliminary ideas, and we'll sort of see what you guys have to say. So, all right, so this is Quinn.
So Alex covered most of it, but I'm just going to say, for the purposes of not getting myself into hot water on the quantum front, I'm going to stick to the script today. Not much ad-libbing today. But just get on with it. Today I'm going to be presenting what I like to consider this blueprint for this paper that I'll hopefully be wrapping up probably by August if I really am diligent about it, on quantizing the state of nature and Hobbes' conception of the metaphor. So my interest in Hobbes, as Alex mentioned, developed over 3 years of pretty much reading only Hobbes as a political theory major. I've read Leviathan front to back about 6 times as a matter of necessity and also just pure obsession. And that all died down as of late. And at the same time, I was starting to begin to engage with this quantum stuff with Alex, and I had already essentially hit a wall with Hobbes and was ready to move on. But like he said, I thought of some of the content in the earlier chapters of Hobbes, which is all extremely mechanistic in nature and reflects a deeply classical picture of the world. And then I began to think about what this might look like in some of the terms that I've been engaging with in Alex's book. So I was even more fascinated about what that might look like extrapolated to the macro levels of government and society and the like. So now my intention really is to quantize the state of nature and Hobbes' conception of it, although that might be a large task. But the key feature here really is his individualist and reductivist analysis of his ontology of the individual. And we take this for granted almost always because it's purely classical, and as such it's relatively obvious. So a few people have asked me though, why Hobbes? And I say because his Leviathan really lends itself to the project more than other state of nature and social contract theorists, simply because of the length for which he addresses the metaphysical and material basis for human beings. His focus on classical mechanics is arguably more so than really any other social contract theorist out there. Locke and Rousseau definitely dedicate time to the state of nature, but do they address the metaphysical aspects from the beginning of their project? Not so much. So these are the chapters of Hobbes' book, though, more often than not, people tend to avoid because they're dense, and they establish really what we already take for granted and what we already know because it's classical. And we commonly understand the meat of his argument for IR purposes and a great deal of political theory. That's all concentrated in chapter 13. And that conception of the world as non-cooperative and a war of all against all is really what makes Hobbes the paradigmatic realist in IR that he is. And then he's also the starting point, in most cases, for liberalism and political theory. But Hobbes himself asks us, truly, that the entire design of his Leviathan be internalized and accepted in full. And that is precisely what he does in doing his due diligence and ruling out all possible alternatives to his argument, starting from the very beginning of mechanics of our world. So in this way, the first thing Hobbes does is, in effect, rule out a quantum world and quantum possibilities. So nonetheless, it is the all-encompassing nature of his argument, albeit causal and mechanical, that really sets the stage perfectly for quantizing the entire design of that argument. So we don't really think about what classical mechanics is because it has always been taken for granted and assumed. And it's assumed that the relevant nature in the state of nature is a mechanical and atomic nature. And we can't really fault Hobbes for that because, well, his contemporaries were Descartes, among other atomistic philosophers that were fueling that mechanical fire. But the state of nature needs to be quantized because of its importance as a metaphor and how we understand the antithesis to government and the pre-social condition that may or may not have ever existed. But nonetheless, 17th century philosophers used the state of nature to show the true necessity of government and restrictions on freedom necessary to achieve peace. But we know that Hobbes wrote Leviathan in part to convince, at least those who could read in the vernacular at that time, that the condition of the English Civil War ought to be avoided at all costs, and that the sovereign ought to be avoided at all costs, or ought to be obeyed at all costs as well. So the state of nature itself, though, is a thought experiment, and whether one subscribes to quantum doesn't really matter, because quantizing a thought experiment is in itself a benign move for social science and political science in general. So if quantum social science people are right, though, about a quantum social world, then we have majorly confused our understanding of the state of nature as a metaphor among really a wealth of other significant political concepts thereafter. So Hobbes' chapters in part 1 of Leviathan, titled Of Man, have titles such as Of Sense, Of Imagination, Of Speech, Of Reason and Science, and so on, and these lend themselves to a particular way of thinking about the state of nature. And they stack the deck, really, for human beings to be completely separable, individualistic, and asocial. So after all, how else would Hobbes illustrate that man is the enemy of every other man prior to a social contract and covenant without first establishing the separable nature of human beings and bodies? So when I suggest that Hobbes understood human beings as fully separable, I mean to say that as a materialist, he thought that human beings were fully self-subsisting in their basic biological functions, so no human being presupposes another. And a person in their mind begins and ends at the edge of their skin, as skin is the material manifestation of separability. So this is the common sense view of how people work by most accounts. When we really think about these sections of Hobbes and Leviathan in quantum terms, from the very beginning of his framework, we get an entirely different picture. And that picture is one of entanglement rather than separability. So by way of example, I'm going to take a stab at this. Hobbes' chapter on sense illustrates the way our senses work. External objects act on our sense receptors, resulting in experience. So something physical and mechanical happens, resulting in a vibration, as he terms it, somewhere in the body. When light hits the eye, a pressing or striking occurs, which results in what he calls fancy. Fancy simply means experience you're having in that moment. So essentially a particle hits the eye and we can see. He describes the external forces to be almost microscopic at their lowest level, although he's using the 17th century terms. So in his own way, Hobbes is subscribing to the standard particle view, but what quantum would add to this picture is a wave dimension, and that wave aspect connects non-locally through vision. So Hobbes' understanding of vision, if quantized, would create an element of non-separability from that which is being seen. This non-local entanglement derives from the wave dimension of vision. And while this is just one example, this entanglement and non-separability dimension is what quantum has to add to the state of nature picture that Hobbes has painted. So classical mechanics and the separability that it implies is really only bound to create a competitive picture, while quantum mechanics and quantum social science invite cooperation through non-local entanglement and separability, and non-separability. With quantum to rewrite the script, it is possible that the state of nature could be something other than the life of man, a solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes understood it. So I'm hoping that the seed of an idea will have serious theoretical implications for Hobbes fanatics like myself, and then regular social scientists alike. And I really welcome your ideas and comments for how this may implicate the higher levels of Hobbes' social contract, entanglement more specifically for Hobbes' fundamental laws of nature, and finally vision as the example I used for the senses to illustrate a potential for quantum. So I'll try to answer any of your questions to the best of my ability, but most importantly, I welcome your ideas on how to develop this argument further. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a really great idea for a paper. So I just want to pick up with the story right where you left off. So my understanding is that after the separability of the individual is constituted in Hobbes' account, I think historically speaking, you're right about the basic history of science being involved in Hobbes in the way that it is that he moves in the next step to talk about why it is that individuals would come into conflict with one another. And one of the key aspects of that argument is that they're in a state of epistemic disagreement with each other, which is to say that there are things that are unknown in the world and they can't decide how to come to grips with those things. They can't decide whether or not they can be saved by one set of ritual practices versus another set of ritual practices, for example. And that this leads them into conflict. That is, at basis, there's an epistemic problem that cannot be resolved except through fiat of the poly. Right? So what would give you grounds to believe that there would be a more optimistic conclusion to that problem in a quantum world? It seems to me that it would take a similarly magical leap of faith to move from the idea that these are quantum beings that are somehow in some kind of entangled relationship with one another to the idea that they would therefore not disagree about fundamental matters, and therefore not have to confront the problem of epistemic conflict, and therefore not have to resolve it through fiat of the state. So, I mean, why is it that a quantum thought experiment about the state of nature would turn out any differently if that's the fundamental problem that Hobbes is confronting?
And I think that's a really good question, and it'd be interesting actually to find out, like, while writing this paper, what those really those amounts would amount to. You know, the calculation, the added value of quantum, what would that be here? You know, diffidence is going to persist, whether or not, you know, we are entangled with one another, you know, vision being the primary example at the sense level, but, you know, whether or not we're entangled with one another, competition for scarcity of resources, all of those things in Hobbes' Leviathan persist. But my thought process here is that by quantizing a lot of the earlier chapters of Hobbes and the metaphysical chapters, we might be able to make some assumptions about how that would change. So the rate for which Hobbes develops the universal consent, that we all consent to government, we all lay down our right and essentially all submit to having the sovereign hold our power and act for us and be our author, I think that might change the way that works and how fast that would happen. It's kind of interesting when you read Hobbes, all of a sudden everybody seems to just all of a sudden be talking to one another and decide that we all need to fix this problem by laying down our right simultaneously. That type of leap might be resolved by some sort of quantum implication here. You know, what would that entanglement conversation look like rather than a matter of necessity because we're all about to die in the face of one another? If that answers your question.
I think it does in an unexpected way, so just to sum up what you said. That one, I was offering you an out from between epistemic disagreement and the sovereign, and you actually said, well, I could still grant you epistemic disagreement and say that the sovereignty itself would work out differently. So those are two potential solutions to the problematic, and you know, you could explore either one. I think your answer is actually more promising.
But if I could just riff on this, which is that, you know, my understanding of quantum game theory is that if you have a prisoner's dilemma, because of entanglement, there's a prediction of more cooperation than there is if there's no entanglement. So I think her intuition is that if you have some entanglement there, you're more likely to get, well, it doesn't mean you'll always get cooperation, but it's more likely. And the higher the entanglement is, the more likely is you're going to get cooperation, even in the PD, is my understanding anyway. So.
Having taught in the prison system of Massachusetts for 3 years, you're absolutely right. I had my prisoners do game theory, and if they were entangled, cooperation happened.
That's interesting.
How does he entangle them?
Yeah. But the question of why Hobbes, I buy it. I think you're right. But why just Hobbes? I mean, Machiavelli was the first realist who brought scientific method, observation, mathematics, experiment into science, into politics. He wanted to make a science out of politics. He was an interlocutor with Da Vinci. He clearly, you know, was heavily influenced by classical science. Why not include more of a pantheon than just simply focus on Hobbes? I know life is short. You've read Leviathan 3 times. You don't want to read The Prince, you know, 5 times, whatever. But I think Machiavelli is in some ways a better foil for your purpose than just Hobbes alone.
Well, that's interesting to know. I read Machiavelli my freshman year in college. I read The Prince, and that was not that didn't really jump out at me as being like the what could
The Art of War is a good place.
The Art of War. Any suggestions you have are good for me because I started the classical mechanics section of this article as a place to just, you know, lay it all out there, and I was already just blown away by what needed to be done thereafter. So The Art of War. And really why, well, Leviathan conveniently because I know it. I know it in and out, through and through. And that seemed like a logical place to start for an undergrad. But life is long, maybe. And I do have a lot of time to read. So I'm not in any rush, really, and I think that potentially quantizing lots of states of nature could end up being a book. And whether or not I write it, I don't know, but somebody should.
So, two quick suggestions and an actual question. Darwin Among the Machines by George Dyson. The first chapter is on the Leviathan as the first artificial intelligence proposition, so that there were actually emergent properties. So that maybe there's already a bit of a quantized moment in the Leviathan, because it's more than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
The second is,
What's the reference?
George Dyson, Darwin Among the Machines. The second is Stephen Chapin's Leviathan and the Air Pump, which I think is probably the best history of the scientific debates that Hobbes was invested in, particularly about air pressure. Schaefer and Chapin, yeah. So here's the question. I'm going to ask you the question that I think contemporary political theory will ask you when you submit this, and you should, which is, what do you want from the quantum? Right? So they're going to have a bit of a normative question for you, although I agree the game theory element has a certain kind of payoff, but they're going to ask why. Like, why do you want to quantize it? And what kind of either normative or theoretical payoff are you expecting when you do it? Right? Is it just cooperation, or is there something like, what does it do to Hobbes as a kind of like new, fancier Hobbes we can go and use? Right? So we use Hobbes all the time.
Well,
Or put it this, to make it simpler, is it more accurate or is it more preferable?
it is more preferable.
Okay.
Hobbes didn't do anything wrong. Hobbes had it right, and I think if Hobbes knew I was doing this right now, he would be pretty ticked off. This is not what he wanted for really any of his project to be conceived as or conceived in. But I do think that my initial impetus to write this and write it right now was because I wanted to write it before anybody else did, and Alex kind of illustrated to me that it would be a race to the finish and write it before anybody else. So that was kind of why I just started getting a move on it. But what do I see it doing for normative political theory or normative IR? I see it making some waves. I see it making some waves in the people that read Hobbes over and over and over again and really just regurgitate secondary literature on what Hobbes has to say about, IR. They conflate a few sentences in chapter 13 and say that he's making this entire analogy about the international world and how, this really never existed, but we can use it as an analogy to understand power relations and all this, that, and the other. Well, if somebody does something completely different with it, maybe we'll start teaching it differently.
Can I follow up right on that? So is it your argument that in chapter 13 he says it's a metaphor? He said, like when he says, if any of you should, whoever so doubteth me, look at the state of princes or whatever.
Yeah,
or
with their forts and kingdoms and garrisons, and he just goes on.
So is it your argument that that's a metaphor, that he does not mean to say there is a state of nature and that state of nature is the empirical state of world politics?
I don't know if I have my own well-developed opinion on that. I've read a great deal of secondary literature on that portion of Leviathan, and it seems to be pretty 50-50. David Gauthier seems to think that we did have a pre-social condition that kind of acted like that, but we were in more of like tribe-like communities, so that way subsisting was possible. I don't necessarily believe that it was just a metaphor, but I'm not that skilled in anthropology, so I can't really say that.
I'm sorry, I'm not asking about the empirics. I'm asking about the internal logic, what you think Hobbes is arguing right there. Because if you think that Hobbes is arguing metaphorically, this is a good, this is a good example of what the state of nature might look like. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. But if you think that Hobbes is saying something different, which is look at the real world is already a state of nature, then that seems to be a different thing.
Yes, so I think then Hobbes was trying to illustrate some sort of matter of dire necessity, that you must obey your sovereign by creating an exact opposite of what government under a sovereign would look like. So by illustrating that, I think it was a rhetorical device and a rhetorical argument really to say, this is how bad it could be, obey the sovereign you have, and don't ask any questions, because he does say that. Whether or not your sovereign is conquered, the new sovereign you get, that's yours. You can't ask any questions. So Hobbes and absolute sovereignty, really, I think that's kind of what he was trying to do, was the antithesis to government. Look, this is this horrible, uncooperative picture, and it necessitates obeying at the absolute level.
Yeah, I think I agree with this reading, because what Hobbes does basically is to pose the problem of order, and then he gives the worst kind of solution that you might face if you don't just follow my prescription. So I agree with it. I have two small suggestions. One is concerning the title. This came to me right away. When you say quantizing Hobbes, it brings back to me when the first time people were saying about quantizing energy, which means precisely the opposite of what you're trying to do. Quantizing energy meant making it discrete in small photons, particles. So you might want to think about using the word quantizing.
Just parenthetically, I will admit that I was the one that inserted the title.
Quantizing doesn't Hobbes.
Yeah, I see your point now. I
Yeah.
didn't even think of that. But
Yeah.
the title, actually, I had to put it in the program because it was deadline, and I couldn't get
Yeah.
hold of it at Quinn. So that's fine,
The other suggestion I have you read the, I think it was in IO, International Organization, piece by Epstein, Charlotte Epstein, where she makes the argument about Hobbes, and she reads the individual in Hobbes as being speaking subject, which means embedded in a language, which means already entangled in a structure. So you might want to read that and see how you can deal with that piece, because it seems to be very important. People might read it that it goes against what you're arguing, so you might want to engage that piece
Okay.
from your perspective.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah, in a way, it just follows up from this last set of issues, because I was a little surprised when you did your talk, you just jumped right into the state of nature thing, but the thing that is most striking about Hobbes, which sort of, at least to me, seems kind of a challenge to the quantum approach, is that Hobbes describes people as this kind of atomistic billiard ball, very classical kind of thing, and you really didn't say much about how a quantum perspective would actually change those building blocks.
That's true.
I mean, that would seem to be the most obvious kind of way in which, if you wanted to do a kind of quantized Hobbes, let's say, right, would be to actually change the nature of atomism that Hobbes is working with. Because he is making a pretty direct analogy between how he imagines the material world to be and how human beings are, right? So it's almost like a microcosm, macrocosm thing in the early part of Leviathan. And I would have thought, okay, the thing you'd do then is to, you know, as it were, have a sort of quantum mechanics view of what atoms are, and then try to build up human beings from that. Which is kind of like what Alex is doing in a way.
I think that's what you just talked about.
Well, but you didn't really talk about the early chapter, because it seems to me, you know, in other words, don't just jump to chapter 13, right? The beginning of the book seems to me the place where you'd want to begin this story and rewrite it in a sense.
It is, and that is where I would start. In terms of me already having an outline for the paper, that is where I start. While my talk might not reflect that, the part of the book that's really actually the most pertinent, I think, is of sense. So of sense is a 6-page chapter in Leviathan, in most of the translations anyways, especially the ones that omit the Latin. And it says of sense, external variables hit the senses. He lists sight, smell, seeing, it's all the same. There's nothing different about seeing than there is about sense, or about smell. All the senses are treated the same in that classical picture. So it might be necessary actually to look at some other Hobbes works. I know there's not much in GTY. I've read GTY and there's not much there.
The whole thing from the ground up, actually, right? I mean, that's the thing I'm suggesting to you, that you'd have to have a kind of rewritten version, like rewriting the Bible today would be like, you know, where you'd have to have more modern, more quantum-style assumptions built in at the level before you even get to talking about the stuff that's more directly relevant to politics.
It has to be under 10,000 words.
I understand that, but look at you. That's the way Leviathan's structured.
Okay. Peter.
Just briefly.
I love this simply for the quickness of mind. It says life is wrong. That was the best put down I've heard in many, many, many years. I was having the same intuition. I visualized Leviathan with all these neat little people inside. That is the picture. And I was also thinking about the chapter on language. This where do you end? I mean, I think where do you end? Given that life is long and short, where do you enter, where do you get your greatest payoff? And it's not clear to me. Maybe it's the chapter on senses, maybe it's a chapter on image, maybe it's just the image. Right? I think given that you want to bound it, the idea is great, but I think you have to be quite strategic about thinking where you want to engage.
Thank you. Bentley was saying that the easiest part is the idea.
Yeah, I guess your paper's probably getting a bit long by now, but interesting connections with economics, because I think it was Francis Edgeworth, an economist 400 years ago, said the principal axiom of economics is that people behave selfishly, and this kind of fed directly from this Hobbesian view of everything. And so, if you kind of quantize that, and you get into quantizing a lot of the fundamental assumptions that have been so influential in economics.
We're almost out of time. Barry?
Yeah. Very cool. And try to speak as loudly as I can. You'll be taking classes here in the fall, is that right?
No, I'm graduating. I'm a junior, but I'm leaving.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
This is a little bit less useful, but a lot of the comments that underscored my initial impression that the literature on complexity might be useful to you. Some of the discussions of the iterated prisms dilemma, for example, discussions of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, and so on and so forth. Those are all very straightforward, sort of central themes in the complexity literature. I was going to suggest you take the class in your political science department, which will be offered in the fall. If you're still going to be around Columbus, you might be able to, if not, you may be able to find something somewhere else. But I think it would be a nice way to both to sharpen the kinds of intuitions you have. I mean, when you write it down, it's kind of a form of informal simulation of forces. You can say exactly what it is about the electrons that's entangled, for example, produces actions, that sort of thing. And to show what large-scale implications follow from slight changes in the small-scale assumptions. So, for example, the classic example of an agent-based model is Schelling's neighborhood model, where he was able to show that you get pretty radical segregation in neighborhoods from very, very modest preferences regarding race. And by the same token, it might be possible for you to show that you can get fairly radical changes in outcomes from very, very minor entanglement. I'd be curious to see if that intuition actually plays out. But I guess I won't be seeing it in the fall. So good luck on that.
Thank you.
So where are you going to grad school?
I actually took an offer from Teach for America, so I'll be teaching in inner city schools for 2 years, and then halfway through I'm going to apply to PhD programs or somewhere.
You should know about quantum.
Quantum pedagogy is Alex's next move.
Time for one last question. Anybody else?
I just have a question about security interdependence. I'm not sure where it comes in. Is the idea you talked initially about self-viability. We do take that assumption. You mentioned realism, like for example, Waltzian realist view is states are self-viable, and then we talk about entanglement, and so that idea of how that would get you cooperation. I'm sure this is obvious to you, but I mean, I would think that if security interdependence gets to a level like, say, nuclear proliferation gets to a level where states cannot be individually self-viable. They can't be viable. They need, that's when we'll get Alex's world government. And you might want to look at Dewey's, Dan Dewey's like negarchy concept.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Speaking of something should be quantized. All right, well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Quinn. Our last paper before the break is Mark Salter, editor of Security Dialogue, which is the premier European security journal, and he's going to talk also about sovereignty. Do you want to stand up here, or do you want to? Yeah, okay. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the organizers and to Quinn. I get to skip over all my stuff about Hobbes now. I want to make two moves today and then pose a question. I'm going to pose my question anyway. The most powerful argument that this seminar can engage is the question of why quantum? What is it that quantum adds? Is there an epistemological or political reason to work from quantum theory to IR? Does the use of quantum theory explain effects, causality, relations that we have otherwise struggled to explain? Does it direct our attention to new questions, relations, or conditions of possibility? And equally, what can international relations give to quantum theorizing? I'm going to take the wager that quantum theory can help us explain assemblages, practices, and conditions of possibility in world politics in ways that are not available to us in positivist and post-positivist frames, primarily because of the insights of multiplicity and nonlinear causation. But in this heroic phase of theory building, I think it is crucial to set out our case carefully. First, I want to argue for putting sovereignty at the heart of IR's engagement with quantum theory. You know, I think if it's okay, I'd much rather the light than the dark. Is that okay? Yeah, thanks. The object is less important than the... And I want to go further, and I want to propose that we gain real analytical leverage when we start to conceptualize decisions as the quanta of politics. Second, building on that notion of decisions as quanta, I think provides us a new framework from which to conceptualize not simply politics, but political science. Thinking of decisions in superposition that are multiple until measured helps us explain individual, institutional, and discursive formations without recurring to models of rationality or even models of quantum brains, which I'm convinced I do not understand at all. However, my final move is to ask a question. What are the politics of importing quantum theory itself to politics and to social science? Do we as critical scholars want to go back to a new, really real scientific realism? When we fall in love, we don't fall in love with our partner. We fall in love with the perception of ourselves that our partner has. And so if I have fallen in love with quantum, then I want to understand what quantum's view is of me that I have really fallen in love with.
We all are falling in love with quantum.
We're all falling, yeah. So, first, I think that we should put sovereignty at the heart of our inquiry into the utility of quantum. For IR scholars, this is not a difficult or challenging argument, but because we're in a diverse group, I want to set the grounds really clearly. If quantum theory is going to speak to IR, it has to speak to the question of sovereignty. The discourse of sovereignty, again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is a theory of the limits of political imagination and the conditions of possibility for authority and autonomy. A linchpin of modernity, sovereignty was a principle by which European states structured international society, which at its formation, we must remember, was much more heterogeneous than our current state system. It set out codes, norms, and practices for regulating and governing different kinds of cross-boundary interaction, the difference between economic activity and warfare, diplomacy and espionage, wars of territorial conquest, or religious crusades. While politics might primarily be about power and identity, be it national, state, religious, or civilizational, international relations is a discourse of difference, about the manner in which we manage irreconcilable differences between political values. Traditionally in IR, contemporary sovereignty is described as the principle by which states are legally autonomous over a defined territorial space and possess juridical equality between states. Krasner, Sasson, and others have all demonstrated the paucity of these ideal types empirically. The authority to make decisions about security, the economy, or other key social values are often made in effect by a number of sub-state, multinational, or international actors like firms, rating agencies, central banks, international organizations, or indeed superpowers. I'm mindful that I'm speaking in front not just of one, but of two flags. That's a lot of flags.
IR theorists focus on sovereignty because inter-sovereign relations are not governed by an ultimate arbiter, like we can assume in domestic politics. The condition of anarchy, whatever its social content, as Alex has demonstrated, is a structural function of sovereignty. Maybe also sovereignty as a unitary, sovereign states as unitary actors is also something to take seriously. For IR scholars and political theorists alike, and for Quinn, Hobbes is a crucial starting point. I don't need to explain why I'm starting at Hobbes. I think, and I agree entirely with Quinn, like she has come to exactly the same point I have, that Hobbes would be profoundly sympathetic to this quantum turn, perhaps because his idealist is materialist. And I think that there's a way in which you could actually double down on the quantum brain by saying that Hobbes views the brain and the thought and consciousness as deeply material because there's no space in Hobbes for anything other than material. And so I agree that you might have to monkey with what that material looks like, but I think that there's something there. The light impacts the eye, which forms the perception, which leads to a rationale, which leads to a decision, which leads to political rationalities, representation, and then the social contract to form the Leviathan. The individual makes this decision to exit the state of nature precisely because of his interpretation of the material conditions of a society without a supreme arbiter. This is where I disagree. I think Hobbes invokes the international as an empirical exemplar of that logic. I think he says, look, it's not just academic, it's not just theoretical, it is out there amongst princes. Now, while Hobbes and others like Conley and Latour focus on the process of representation that is at the heart of the workings of the Leviathan, I want to track his argument a bit earlier to highlight the importance of decision. It's my argument here and elsewhere that the essence of sovereignty is decision, and in particular the decision to include or exclude. The most important capacity of the sovereignty, not right, not responsibility, but capacity, is to decide on the constitution of the identity. And I mean this in a very ecumenical sense. The borders, the population, the sphere, the space of what is governable. What marks sovereignty is the authority that it appropriates to itself to decide on the interior boundaries of politics, and by implication, something which, like Hobbes, Latour, Conley do less with, the boundaries and the limits of exterior politics or politics between sovereign states. These decisions are all historically contingent and contextually specific. The invention of the economy, as Mitchell identifies, or the social, as Foucault identifies, relate to a complex series of decisions about what might be included in politics. For me, and for theorists like Schmidt, Agamben, and Latour, the essence of sovereignty is the capacity to draw boundaries and execute decisions in support of those borders. Sorry, I'll come back to the Eskimo identity disc, but this is another example of Canadians asserting their sovereignty up north. For me then, quantum theory has to demonstrate that it can add some analytical leverage to our current understanding of decisions and of boundaries. This brings me to my second move. If decisions are the quanta of politics, do the insights of quantum theory on, for example, superposition, give us fresh analytic resources that will lead to new kinds of analysis? As Badruddin has already indicated, I'm very self-conscious of oversimplifying complicated physical concepts, so I'm going to explain my bare understanding in the hopes of making the conversation clear. Quanta are the smallest possible divisible mode of energy, and such. I think that quanta that decisions are the quanta of politics. They are the smallest possible element of political decisions. They are multiplicitous and have a plural essence that collapses under interference, including observation. Thus, quanta are always in process, always in relation to their interactions or observations. Now, in the previous section, I argued that decisions are the quanta of politics and that the essence of sovereignty is inclusion. Here's the striking parallel between social theory and quantum theory, and I think that this is along Scott's lines. Identities, borders, and orders are already multiple, overlapping, and overdetermined until measured, in which case they materialize in relation to the measuring tool being used. The plurality of facts, theories, evidence, supposition about identity collapse into a single decision to grant citizenship, cross a border, or interfere in an economic or social transaction. Decisions are the smallest possible data points of politics, which are multiple until interactive. So here what happened when Canada was in the process of asserting its authority over the high north in the mid-1940s, early to mid-1940s, was that the Canadian state realized that it didn't know how many Eskimos there were. We would call them Inuit today. And so in addition to the census, they gave all Inuit a dog tag, modeled, which is a sort of leatherette that had a unique identifying number. Within 5 years, this disc itself became the claim for citizenship. And so under Canadian regulations, the way that one demonstrated that one was Inuit and therefore a citizen became the material object. And so to me, this is a really clear case of the measuring tool creating the population, which then goes on to have other material political effects. Quantum theory is also particularly helpful in setting out the relations between social theory, social science, and practical politics. If we understand from Latour, Barad, and others that the qualities of the quanta, or decision, are derivative of the measurement tool because observation is interference, then we can understand the way that the census creates the population, the biometric passport kiosk creates particular forms of legible bodies, how the World Bank best practices document creates particular forms of the economy. Foucault, Bourdieu, and Latour, and similar theorists might argue that particular discursive and socio-technical formations make a set of decisions possible or set the conditions of possibility. But I think that here quantum theory gives us a stronger argument for a direct relationship, that these populations, bodies, and economies are multiple, have no predetermined essence, but that the active measurement collapses those multiplicities into qualities that can be measured. So here I think quantum offers a stronger causal link than post-structuralism does, even though they're in the same, they have the same goal. The visibility of sovereign boundaries and what is understood as the norm of territorial boundaries are equally derivative of the measuring instrument. Here, to me, the clear analytical value added of quantum theory for social science is that when decisions as quanta are understood not of moments of decisions or a particular set of calculations, but rather as a field of probability that collapse into specific formulations upon measurement, I think that gets us out of rational actor models. It gets us out of post-structural language games towards something more specific. This brings me to my final point, which is a question. Plainly, I think that the quantum term is crucial for mainstream IR, but I wonder if it's useful for critical theory. Freud once said in a letter that he came to by science what Nietzsche might have come to by accident, so he didn't read any Nietzsche. He made a point of not reading Nietzsche. So I wonder if quantum theory hasn't arrived at by science what post-structuralism arrived at through critical theory. I want to ask the question, is the substantive difference between quantum-inflected IR and critical IR that the quantum appeals to hard, experimentally driven science? What concerns me, and what I frankly haven't worked out fully for myself, and I look forward to your help in that, is the political importance of this new appeal to a really real scientific realism. On the one hand, quantum seems to provide a scientifically established, experimentally verified model of social reality that conforms with many of my expectations and understandings that the post-structural understanding of the social construction of identities, borders, and orders provides. Meaning is interpolated, multiple, dependent on the observer. Check. Boundaries are constructed, fluid, and mobile. Check, check. Causality is not efficient, but somewhat chaotic, unpredictable, nonlinear, probabilistic, troubling even our basic notions of space. Check, check, check. Well, I think that's right. We all agree. On the other hand, we have a substantial post-Enlightenment critique of the appeal to scientific epistemology as a frame for engaging and crafting human projects. From Michel Foucault to James Scott to Timothy Mitchell, social theory and sociology has been widely critical of the human, societal, and ecological effects of large-scale scientific efforts to manage populations. I've spent my professional life trying to get away from the parsimony of scientism that characterize mainstream IR, and I'm loath to give it up just because it might be true, according to your evidence, just as post-structuralism was true according to its own evidence. Someone needs to convince me that returning to the appeal of the scientific is worth the danger of the epistemic realism that Ashley and Walker warned us of 30 years ago. So here's my best shodden answer. I think that I would borrow from Latour and say we were wrong, we were never modern, that there is no useful distinction between the science and political. We are prisoners of Hobbes' legacy of the separation between the scientific and the political. As Latour sets out, just as Jarrah said, following Chapin and Schaeffer's The Leviathan and the Air Pump, the ontological split between scientific and political ways of knowing that is personified in the debate between Hobbes and Boyle on the proper derivation of truth and fact correspondingly was always unstable and obscured the multiple imbrication of scientific and political ways of truth-telling. Latour says that Hobbes makes the argument for arguing from first principles, Boyle makes it from laboratory science. Latour says in essence that what happens at the heart of modernity is an epistemological split that says there is a way to conduct science, there is a way to conduct politics, and those are separate. Latour says that they were never separate, that those two exist together in one system that's mutually imbricating. One possible answer is that quantum theory actually reverses the Hobbes-Boyle split between the scientific and the political that Latour diagnoses. Quantum theory does not allow us to separate out scientific matters of fact derived from our experimental data and socio-political matters of concern that are debated through representation. Not only does quantum theory reveal the profoundly social and negotiated nature of its knowledge production, because the science of measurement specifically negotiates with the world, but it demonstrates that physical relations are much more sociable and interdependent than we had assumed under a Newtonian model of causality. As Latour advocates, the scientific is deeply social and the political is profoundly inflected with scientific truths. By a tentative way of conclusion, I've tried to advance three main arguments: that sovereignty is at the heart of international relations, decisions are the essence of politics, and that boundary drawing, the political element of those decisions is constitutive both of the domestic scene and the possibilities of the international. Quantum theory gives a new way to think about the multiplicity of decisions in relation to their measurement devices, including the social sciences. In other words, before there is a measurement tool like a census, a passport, or a finding, the factish world is messy and multiple, which then collapses into particular decisions of inclusion or exclusion, which then still remain messy, but are derivative of that measurement device. And finally, I think that quantum theory needs to explain its politics to social science before we take the step of adopting it. I think that one possible way to make that argument, which I think critical scholars might be seen as regressive, is to argue with Latour that social science must not so much transcend the division of political and scientific truth machines, but rather resist the discourse altogether that establishes a division between those two truth machines altogether. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes, please.
Did you say that post-structuralism and quantum have the same goal? Did I hear that right?
I think that like Scott, I have the sense that they have really similar ways of understanding the world as socially constructed. Now, I think that what post-structuralism does is it refrains from decisions, right? Like that the post-structuralist diagnosis says any further answer or anything other than a diagnosis has violent power effects. And so therefore it refrains from sort of acting. I think that maybe you could argue that quantum has the same kind of hesitancy because every measurement affects a particular, every measurement affects the system. And so it seems to me that there's a similar kind of ontology of hesitation there.
It doesn't have to be that way, though, right? I mean, in a sense, you're saying, I mean, post-structuralists are afraid of their own power, in a sense. And why would quantum...
Modest with their own power, maybe, than afraid.
Okay, modest. But there's also an anxiety about using it, right? Okay, and that's more on the fear side.
Yes.
It's not obvious to me that quantum theory, whether it's in the physical sciences or social, would have any such fear. I mean, they would be obviously conscious of their epistemic limitations and all that kind of stuff. But normatively, to sort of refrain from action altogether, why would that follow?
Okay, I take that point. Yes, Matthias.
I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Terry Pratchett's works, I guess.
Discworld, yes.
And there is this group of Dashing Coffee. And I've come to think about the relation between quantum thought and post-structural thought. It's the same as between Dashing Coffee and regular coffee. Regular coffee sobers you up. And Dashing Coffee, as Terry Pratchett says, doesn't just sober you up, it takes you through sobriety and out the other side.
Which means what?
Well, it's counterintuitive. No, this just came to my mind. I mean, I tremendously enjoyed the thoughts in this presentation. I was not sure how essential actually this claim that decisions are the quanta of politics is to your entire argument. You could simply say a quantum approach helps me to understand decisions in politics and leave indeterminate for the time being whether these really are the quanta of social science, because it seems you invite an entire new discussion and a lot of baggage into the argument, which I don't see how you really need them, how you need this baggage. But maybe we can say a bit more about it.
Thank you. What do you think? I mean, do you? I mean, it seems to me that I take the argument from Agamben, problematic as it is, that the most important part of sovereignty is the ban. You know, like, is the capacity to include or exclude, the capacity to say that something is normal or exceptional. And I think that I think that I take that point. And so I think that that's where I want to be able to loop back to. And in particular, because I think that Latour's theorization of political and political decisions is so weak that I think that one needs a strong theory of politics in order to follow this line of thinking through. I appreciate that I need to make that connection much more clear.
Just a little follow-up. I mean, I guess turned around the question would be, could you be making the same argument outside the theoretical framework which you take and apply it in a sense to any kind of analysis that thinks about decisions in politics?
Thank you. Yes, are you following? Oh, okay. Yes, Steve.
Yeah. It's interesting you brought up Leviathan and the air pump in this context, because I think that, especially if you're talking about decisions being taken, but maybe you could clarify something for me, because I think the way in which I think Leviathan, the story that's being presented in Leviathan and the air pump feeds into a kind of quantum story, is that you might say, in the beginning, that is to say, before Hobbes gets excluded from the Royal Society, because that's kind of the decision moment, right? There's no clear distinction between the philosophers and the scientists, right? It's a kind of undifferentiated kind of argument, right? And Hobbes has all these skeptical objections about what the air pump can do. And they're allowed and they're discussed until a certain point where Hobbes is just excluded from the Royal Society and his arguments don't matter anymore. And the consequence of that decision is that you start to get then this kind of divide between philosophy and science. Right? This is kind of the way the story is presented, and the way it's presented as a story about how science got invented, basically. And it was invented by excluding all the philosophical critics. And it happened then, at that moment. Okay? That's what the story is. Now, what I don't get from your presentation is whether you regret this, whether you endorse this, whether you think the issue ought to be reopened again. I mean, I'm just sort of curious, because you keep on talking about these, this blurred possibility space between science and politics and perhaps philosophy and science and all the rest of it. But in a sense, what Leviathan and the Air Pump was showing was that the decision space got closed.
Yeah.
They got closed. And in a sense, the reason why that book's so powerful and why it's so influential, why all you guys are talking about it, because in some sense, we seem to be living still with the results of that decision. That in some sense, that settlement still holds. Right? And so what are you trying to do? Reopen it?
Yeah.
Okay, no, just to be clear, because... Yes.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. I think that the most underdeveloped part of that book is the last third, where they purport to talk about the political implications of that split, but then never do. And so I think that one of the things that Latour's project does in We Have Never Been Modern, in making things public, and maybe, maybe the inquiry into modes of inquiry, is precisely, existence, is to try and speculate what a version of that kind of politics would be that included both scientific, material, and political truth. But I think that But I think that his theory of politics is so anemic at that point that's why I think we need to go back to the decision, is because I think that his notion of politics just becomes then about that circle of representation from the many to the one on blah, 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 and I think that's...
Sorry.
3 minutes left. 3 minutes left.
Excuse me, I apologize.
So first, the thing I think is brilliant about this paper is it goes in exactly the opposite direction of all the Homo quantum. Right? Because Homo quantum is like, hey, quantum's just like Derrida, it's all indiscernibility. Right? You're going the Planck way, which is actually, right, there's a consolidation. Right? So I think that part's really important, and why I think, Matthias, you can't back off that, because that's what makes it cool. But here's the question part of that. I get why you want the decision to be a thing that can't be broken down into any smaller part.
Yeah.
Right? It is undeconstructible in a certain sense.
Yeah.
The flip side, though, is the project that you're talking about with Steve, where, like in the inquiry in the modes of existence, where Latour says the basis of any kind of speculation on that is the reestablishment of trust between science and basically post-structuralists, indigenous people, anybody who adopts them.
Yeah.
That decisional unit being inaccessible seems to be an almost law-like separation in the possibility of rebuilding trust. Because we're stuck with this decisionistic model where we have to decide, right? Like every time there's a decision.
Yeah. Okay. But like. Yeah. But. Right, but don't you? But I think that this is the interesting insight of quantum, is that multiplicity decision or multiplicity collapse is constantly recursive.
It's
so
iterative, but it's iterative isomorphically. It becomes the same packet every time.
Okay, this is so here's one of the points of opening that I want to bring. It's the Circumpolar Inuit Declaration in the Arctic, and first of all, like they've read Bierstecker and Weber, like they say sovereignty is a historically constructed construct that it changes over time and there are multiple iterations and different contesting definitions, like it's super good and clear. But what's interesting is that they start off by saying, when, like up on section 1, that they claim sovereignty over the Arctic and sovereignty as a right of consultation, not of decision. And then they say, we claim this right because we are indigenous peoples. And so then they talk about their rights as indigenous peoples. Then secondly, as citizens of Arctic states. So then they sort of recur to a sovereign. Then third, as possessors of knowledge of folks who have been there since time immemorial. So then that's another one. So there seems to be a really interesting case where there's a multiplicity of claims that contests sovereignty. So I think that this would, that there's a possibility of collapse again if we interrogate it too much. Maybe that's, like as Nora said, that's the problem. But I think that here is a place of opening where emphasizing the decision about whether to include or exclude has real political meaning that we need to excavate. Does that make sense?
Well, either resorting to a decisionism of Schmitt that leads to the authoritarianism that Joe's is warning us of.
And by the way, I'm worried about it at the methodological level, right? The decision over quantum being true or not true, right? Meta before you get to the political negotiation part.
No, but I need to explain why. I need to think. I need to think more clearly about why not. I think to me, the Latour, even though he has a weak politics, has a better answer to that, which is that it is about constructions of matters of concern. But I need to think about that more, because I think that Latour is really shitty on Schmitt, and like facing Gaia, I think is really problematic, and so I'm trying to work that through right now.
Nora, did you want to have the last word? Okay, all right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
All right.